So we're concluding our parable of the lost son today and concluding the series we've been in for a little while now, Stories Jesus Told. And as we've looked at this parable of the lost son, also known as the prodigal son, over the past few weeks, we've realized in our study that this is actually included in a series of parables, these lost parables. There's the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and then the parable of the lost son. And so a few weeks ago, we looked at this parable of the lost sheep, and we looked at the parable of the lost coin, and then this is the third week on the parable of the lost son. And let's be reminded again, and we've talked about this over and over again, why Jesus told these lost parables. He told them back to back to back, all three of them in a row. And we can read them in Luke chapter 15. And he told these parables because the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, these very religious people, were upset with him. They were upset because he was hanging out with really bad people. He was hanging out with the wrong crowd. He was hanging out with the worst of the worst. He was hanging out with the tax collectors and the sinners, and they just could not understand that. And so Jesus told them these parables. He said, this is why I came. I came to seek and to save the lost. And he actually spoke those very words to a very famous tax collector that you know as Zacchaeus. And we can read about that later on in the book of Luke chapter 19, verse 10. And this has been our theme verse throughout the series. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Will you read it with me or say it with me one more time? For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. And so in this parable of the lost son, a parable that many of you are familiar with, there are three characters. We looked at the younger son a couple weeks ago, and the picture that we got from the younger son is this. He was a very shameful boy, very dishonorable to his father, very rebellious. That's the picture we get. And yet, and this is so important, and yet he was repentant. He returned to his father. And then last week we looked at the older son. And the picture that we got from the older son was that, this kid looked good on the outside. He did the right things. He was morally good. But he had no relationship with the father. In fact, he was even resentful to his father. He was unappreciative to what the father had given him. He was self-righteous. He was judgmental, which is the perfect picture of the Pharisees, who Jesus is speaking to. The Pharisees found themselves right smack dab in the middle of Jesus' parable as one of the characters, as the older son. And so last week we saw that there was a surprise ending to the parable. The people that Jesus was speaking to would not have expected this. They find out at the end of the parable that it's actually the older son who is the lost son in the parable, not the younger son. See, the younger son, he recognized his lostness, and he returned to the father. He repented and he turned. But the older son, he didn't recognize his lostness, and he stays outside the party, and he's unwilling to join. He's still relationally distant to the father. So that's the younger son, the older son. And the third and most important character in this story is the father, and that's what I want to spend our time today talking about. And of course, we know that the father in this parable is a representation of our Father in heaven. So what do we learn? What do we learn about the Father? What do we learn about the Father in heaven and his love? A few things that I want to highlight. First of all, we learn that he has a love that pursues. A love that pursues. And this is so incredible. We saw it in the parable of the lost sheep a few weeks ago. Just like this shepherd that seeks and pursues until he can find that lost sheep and bring the sheep home. And he's like that woman who's on her hands and knees and getting dirty and sweeping through the dust in order to find the coin that is so valuable to her. And of course, in this parable, the parable of the lost son, he's like the father who seeks and pursues a relationship, not only with his younger son, but with his older son as well, with both sons. As a way of review, we read in verse 20, so he got up, the younger son got up, and he went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. The father had been still longing for a relationship with that son and scanning the horizon and searching for his son. And when he saw his son, he was filled with compassion for him, and he ran to his son. He ran to him. He threw his arms around him, and he kissed him. Even after the father was shamefully dishonored by his younger son, he doesn't give up. He continually scans the horizon, searching for his son, hoping his son will return. And then when he sees his son coming, he runs to him. He throws his arms around him, and he kisses him. And he shamefully dishonors himself in the process. He welcomes his son home. But he also pursued the older son. Verse 28, we looked at this last week. The older brother became angry and refused to go into the party. So what did the father do? The father went out to him, went out and pleaded with him. And once again, the Pharisees, as they're hearing the story, they would have said, there's no way a Jewish man would go out towards a disrespectful son like this and plead with his son. That's not what an honorable father would do, but that's what this father did. He went out to the older son. This older son didn't deserve the father's love either. He was relationally distant. He stood outside of the party, but the father felt the older son's absence, and so the father humbled himself and went out to his older son, pursued him, pleaded with him. And so as we look at these pictures of the father from all of these lost parables, it's just incredible. The shepherd who returns with the sheep around his shoulders. The woman who just sweeps in the dirt, desperately searching, on her hands and knees searching. The father running through the streets with his robe pulled up, humbling himself, going out to a disrespectful son, never giving up. He has a love that seeks, a love that pursues, a relationship even with each of you and with me. It's also, the Father's love is also a love that reconciles. So remember, if you were here a couple weeks ago, remember what the younger son was expecting. As he's coming home, as he's getting ready to return to the father, he's expecting that the father is going to slap him in the face, turn him away. He's probably expecting that he's not going to be accepted back. But he's hoping that maybe if he falls at the father's feet and he begs for mercy, that maybe he can be hired back as a hired hand, as a servant, and live in town. But there's no way he would be accepted as part of the family. That would have been unheard of. And so that's what he's hoping. He's hoping that he'll just, beg for mercy and that he'll be welcomed back as a hired hand. When he returns, he repents. He says, I've sinned against heaven. I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. He's in the midst of this speech that he planned ahead of time. But remember, the father interrupts him before he gets to the part of, just hire me back as a hired hand. The father said, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on him. I will have nothing of this talk of you being a hired servant. Quick! He interrupts him. You're not a hired servant. You're my son. And to demonstrate full reconciliation of this relationship, he gives him three things: the robe, a ring, and sandals. And this robe would have been reserved for the most honored of guests. After the son had dishonored his father in such a way, the father welcomes him back and honors him. I'm going to honor you with this robe. He has sandals put on his feet. Servants didn't wear sandals. They couldn't afford sandals. The father says, you're not a servant. You're my son. Put sandals on his feet. And then he gives them this ring. This ring would have been a big deal. This was a signet ring. And this was the family seal. It was used as a stamp to approve transactions on behalf of the father, on behalf of the family. And so remember, the younger son told his father, I wish you were dead. I want to have nothing to do with you. Just give me my inheritance. But now the father welcomes him back and says, you're fully my son, and you have full authority to represent me now. No more shame here. The father didn't ask for the money back. The father didn't ask the son how he squandered all that inheritance. He just completely forgave him and welcomed him home and honored him. And it's the same with you and I. You know, when we come to our senses and we turn to our Father in heaven, He welcomes us into the family. He fully welcomes us. No matter who we are, no matter what we've done, you're a child of the Heavenly Father, because He has a love that reconciles the relationship completely. He also has a love that satisfies. Let's consider this. The Father demonstrated His love, and I don't know if we usually think of this, but the Father demonstrated His love by letting the younger son go in the beginning. He let the younger son go, and I think that is a tremendous example of His love. He could have said, when the son came to him and said, give me my inheritance, I want it now, he could have said no. He had every right to refuse that. He could have sent his son away and said, you want your inheritance now? Well, you've got none of it. You're out of the family because you're treating me that way. But he didn't. He went ahead and honored the request. He divided the inheritance and gave his son the portion. Why did he do that? He knew his son had no love for him, but he loved his son enough to let him go. To let him go because he knew that by letting him go, that was the route back to himself. He knew that the younger son would have to experience heartache and loss. He knew that his son would have to sow his wild oats in order to come to his senses and realize that nothing brings satisfaction, nothing brings fulfillment other than the love of my Father. In verse 23, when the son returns and the father puts the robe on him and the sandals on him and the ring on his finger, he says, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. Remember, the younger son had been starving and he longed for the food of the pigs. He just wanted to fill his belly with pig food. But when he returns, the father says, let's kill the fattened calf. Let's feast. The younger son is finally going to be completely and fully satisfied in what the Father has to offer. Not only physically, but spiritually. And you remember when the older son's on the outside of the party, refusing to go in, he's angry and resentful. What does the father tell the older son? My son, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. And the older son failed to recognize and accept the father's love, and he's still left on the outside of the party. And you remember what he said? He's just longing for a young goat. I've never even received a young goat to party with my friends. He's longing for lesser things. He's still trying to satisfy himself when the Father has so much waiting for him. This fattened calf is for you too. We will celebrate you too. Because Father owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. And so just like the Father in this parable, our Heavenly Father knows that we have to experience a life that doesn't satisfy in order to bring us to himself, to recognize his abundant life. It's the only way we can find life to the full. Jesus said, I have come that you might have life and have it to the full. And that's what your Father in heaven has to offer you, because his love is the only love that satisfies completely. And finally, the Father's love is a love that rejoices. Way back in the parable of the lost sheep in verse 6, it says, then he calls his friends, the shepherd calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I found my lost sheep. In the parable of the lost coin, when she finds the coin she's been looking for, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I found my lost coin. And then in this parable, bring the fattened calf, kill it, let's have a feast. Let's celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. At the end of the parable, but we had to celebrate and be glad. We had to celebrate because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. It's the second time the Father said that in the parable. Throughout these parables, in this chapter, just a short chapter, the words joyfully and rejoice and celebrate are used over and over and over again. And I encourage you to go home this week and read Luke chapter 15 again. Read all these parables again and see how many times you can pick out those words. Joyfully, rejoicing, celebration. Because this is God's heart. This is the Father's heart for his people. And I think we can understand this a little bit as for those of us who are parents. You know, when your child, when they're younger, they come and they come to you for help when they need something. There's some joy in that. Or when, your child's upset with you and then they come and they crawl up in your lap. We can feel that joy. Or maybe it's an older child who's been away for a long time and they finally come home. What joy we experience as parents when our kids come to us. Well, how much more joy the Father in heaven experiences when one lost son or daughter repents. You bring him joy. You bring him joy. He throws a party over you. He celebrates over you when you turn to him. So it makes me think, what do I celebrate? What do I celebrate? Well, I celebrate when my team wins. Yay, it's so exciting, right? When there's a buzzer beater, it's so exciting. Maybe if you're a UCLA fan, you're not too excited about that. But, we celebrate those types of things. What do you celebrate? Because we celebrate what's most important to us, what we care about the most. And so I think about, what do we celebrate as a church? What do we celebrate? Do we celebrate attendance? Do we celebrate when this room's full? When a lot of people are watching online? That's cool and all, and that's important. But we should be celebrating baptisms. We should be celebrating people coming to Christ. As a church, we celebrate relationships. We celebrate reconciliation. We celebrate what God is doing in people's lives. We celebrate right along with the Father when the lost are found, when they embrace a life of faith. Those are the things. Those are the things that matter, and those are the things that we celebrate. So remember once again, and we mentioned this last week, from the perspective of the Pharisees, and I think we mentioned this a couple weeks ago, from the perspective of the Pharisees as they're listening to this story that Jesus is telling. The father in the parable, his behavior is shameful. To them, his behavior is dishonorable, because an honorable Jewish man just wouldn't act like this towards either of these sons. That's just not what they would do. But remember, it's a prodigal kind of love. A wasteful kind of love, it seems. spent recklessly on people who don't deserve it, like you and like me, because it's a love that pursues, a love that reconciles, a love that satisfies, and a love that rejoices. And so, as I conclude this morning, I just have a very simple application. Do you long for this kind of love? Anyone in the room? Anyone watching online? Do you long for this kind of love? Do you recognize your lostness? Do you recognize that because of your sin, you're separated from your Father, you're separated from your Creator, and you're not experiencing any life to the full? You're not experiencing what you could experience when you're united to your Father. If you recognize that, then it's time to turn to your Father in repentance. It's time to turn to Him through Jesus and His sacrifice for you, because He's the one that brings you back to your Father. And so if you have questions about that, I would love to talk to you. I'd love to meet and just chat over coffee. So you can talk to me after the service. You can send me a message if you're watching online through the connection card. But remember last week, as we concluded this parable, there was just an abrupt ending. The parable ends. Jesus doesn't really put an ending on the parable. And the people listening, they would have been kind of confused. Where's the ending? There's no ending, and they're left hanging, and we're left hanging. Well, the Father wrote the ending. You see, in the greatest acts of love, the greatest act of love ever, a prodigal kind of love, a wasteful kind of love, it seems. Jesus left His Father. Jesus went to a faraway land. Jesus experienced poverty and humiliation. It wasn't an act of rebellion like the younger son. It was an act of obedience. And He lived a completely obedient life, a life that none of us could live as lost children. He became lost for us. And He died the death in our place. The Son was spent wastefully on our behalf for our lostness, in order to bring us back with Him, safe and sound to the Father. And so maybe at this point in the service, you're saying, this is not Easter, right? I mean, at Easter, we're not supposed to focus on the sacrifice and the cross. We're supposed to focus on the resurrection. Well, the cross and the sacrifice of Jesus and the empty tomb go hand in hand, right? We know that. Because of the sacrifice of Jesus, we can go from being lost to being found. Lost because of our sin, separated because of our sin, but now we can be found. Because of the resurrection, we can go from death to life. Because Jesus is alive, we can experience life. And not only life, someday, and life eternal with the Father, but life here and now. Abundant life that satisfies. And so when we think about these lost parables, there's another surprise ending, isn't there? There's another surprise ending to this parable. And to talk about it, I want to circle right back around to why Jesus was telling this parable to begin with, and why He told these parables to begin with. Pharisees are disgusted with Jesus because He's hanging out with the bad crowd, with the worst of the worst of the worst. He's hanging out with sinful people. He's hanging out with tax collectors. And one of those very sinful tax collectors was Matthew. And in Matthew, in fact, Jesus went up to Matthew when he was in the act of collecting taxes. Jesus approached him at his tax collector's booth when he's right in the act of treason and collecting these taxes for Rome.
And Jesus walks up to him and says, Matthew, I want you to follow me. I want you to become one of my closest friends. And leave your tax collecting behind. And Matthew does. And Matthew follows Jesus. In fact, they go to Matthew's house and they have a party. And Jesus hangs out with other tax collectors and sinners. And of course, the Pharisees are upset with that. And Matthew's life was changed. Matthew went from being dead to being alive. And most of you know that he wrote one of the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He wrote one of the accounts of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And in the beginning of Matthew's gospel, there's a genealogy. And Matthew does something very unique. He includes some people in his genealogy that shouldn't be included. And we actually studied this a couple years ago at Christmas time. Some people in his genealogy that were outcasts that should never be included in a genealogy. But Matthew did, because it was as if Matthew, throughout the rest of his life, was always remembering how Jesus pursued him as an outcast, how Jesus welcomed him, and Jesus asked him to be his closest follower, one of his closest followers. And so Matthew's so grateful that Jesus welcomed me as an outcast, and he welcomes all these outcasts and sinners. And Matthew's life was changed forever. But here's the deal. At Jesus' death, it was over. It was over for Matthew. When Jesus was arrested, the disciples fled. They took off. Matthew fled. He took off. They went into hiding. It was all over. It was all over. They were duped. It was the end. Jesus wasn't who he said he was. And I contend that Matthew, at that point, would have just went back to what he knew. He would have went back to being a tax collector at that point. Nothing would have changed in his life. And this is the biggest, one of my favorite evidences of the resurrection of Jesus, because we know that Matthew didn't go back to life as he knew it. His life was changed. He went from death to life. We know that he dedicated the rest of his life to spreading the message of Jesus and the good news of Jesus. We know that Matthew was martyred, was killed. He gave up his life because of Jesus to spread this message. So what happened to Matthew? It wasn't Jesus' death. See, he saw Jesus die, and then 3 days later, he saw Jesus alive again. And that's what changed him. Because Jesus came back to life, Matthew's life was changed, and he went from death to life. And it was the same with the rest of the disciples. Matthew experienced the resurrection of Jesus, and his life was changed. And it's the same for us today. And so today, as we gather, we celebrate that the Father in heaven declares, this Son of mine was dead, and he's alive again.